So, I figured I'd share my experience with living in a 200-year-old cabin. All these things happened in the span of 3 years that I lived there, beginning in 2012. A childhood friend from years back asked if I'd be her roommate. I needed out of my parents' house and she needed a roommate. Seemed like a good situation. Now, for the house. Nestled in a suburban area was this cabin. The cabin dates back to sometime in the 1700s, we think. The road the cabin is off bears the same name as the original family of the house. They owned a large portion of the land that is now one of the largest cities in the U.S. If you search American colonial cabin, you'll see a swath of images that look just like it. We think it was originally used as a slave quarters, as this is tobacco country, and then later turned into a stable house. The stable house theory checks out, as our dog dug up a horseshoe once. I still have the horseshoe. The night we moved in, I knew the place was eerie. No door to the upstairs. No doors to the downstairs bedroom. Her room, though, was an addition that someone had added in the 80s. The previous owners also added a much-needed kitchen and bathroom, as the original layout did not have either. So, now that you've got a decent imagery of what I was working with, I'll start with why I'm posting. So when moving in, I immediately felt a feeling of being watched. The house, it always felt dark, cold, and moist. Much like a cellar. I mean, par for the course with that type of house, but there was something else. It started with scratching. Every night I would be in bed. I would wake up to this scratching directly underneath my bed. At first, I thought it was mice, but when I listened to it long enough, I realized the scratching was a long, drawn-out, foot-long pole, then repeated. I just covered my head, muffled my ears, and closed my eyes. I mean, I was a 23-year-old man, by the way. I felt like I was cowering, but I wasn't about to tussle with wood-scratching spirits. So one night I heard it start. Normally I would have been asleep at this time, but I was up late and heard it. It started on the ceiling on the far left of my room. Then it went down the wall, then scratched its way to directly underneath me. After a while, the scratching went across the room and back to the wall, then gone. And here's why it's not mice. My walls were solid wood, as the logs were the same as the outside. The floor had no spaces between the ceiling and below the floor. Like I said, old cabin. Alright, so I'm gonna speed this up a bit before I hit my post limit. I got scared and started sleeping downstairs. Roommate, now wife, asked what was up, and I told her. She said the same stuff was going on when she's home alone. And this is all in the first week. Here's the creepy part. So, when we moved in, I had to unscrew all of the screws that the previous renter had put into the windows. I had to unscrew the ones of the exterior doors that he screwed shut. We had to clean out a weird rabbit food, we think, from the oven. We had to write "does not live here" on the hundreds of mail order catalogs the previous renter received. We always joked that the guy was a shut-in Satanist, but now I don't think we were too far off. Soon, we both started sleeping downstairs in the living room and felt comfort in numbers. The eerie feeling was easier to deal with if someone was with you. Until one night, I had a dream that a dark force was approaching me. It was in third person, as if I was watching myself sleep. The entity starts looming over my head, and all the while, I felt a pressure building in my head and a high-pitched ringing in my ears. It got so intense that I sprung up from my sleep and looked around the room. About a second later, the TV shut off. Just cut off. We had been having problems with the TV randomly turning on and off, but this time was far too coincidental to be brushed off like everything else. Also, I knew I went to bed with the TV turned off. Why was it on in the first place? I started sleeping in her room after that. She told me nothing really happened in her room. Maybe because it was an addition, I don't know. Well, our ghost played matchmaker, and now we're trying for a kid, married for 5 years. Anywho, once I was upstairs reading, and as I was falling asleep, my windows started opening and shutting. I was already at my wit's end with the spirit, so the next day, I set up the same situation. Same thing. Funny. Never does that when I'm not there. I ended up yelling, telling it to leave us alone. I was so tired of it, and holy smokes, it worked for a while. Then when I was home alone, alarm clocks started going off as soon as my wife would leave. Drawers would open, banging on the front door. Then, over time, it just stopped, slowed down, ultimately to nothing. I guess as I matured there, it stopped messing with me. Today my in-laws live there. They were my landlords, and the home is cute, homey, and warm. I spend time there alone and don't feel any malice. Weird experience. I would do it all over again if I had to. I'm open to questions. This is 100% real, and I can give further details. A strange occurrence happened this morning after I dropped my mom off at the dentist. I had a couple hours to kill in an old Mississippi town I was not too familiar with. So I started driving around, looking at the old houses and architecture. Anyway, that got me feeling pretty froggy, so I googled haunted town name. Like I sometimes do when I have time to kill in a new place. I like doing that because, at the very least, you'll probably find some really cool, creepy old places to go check out. And, of course, there's always the chance that it's actually haunted. Now, I will say, I've always thought I was sensitive to certain types of energy, but for the most part, I'm very skeptic. Just fascinated with the idea of it all. So I found an article for a cemetery dating back to the mid-1800s that was supposedly loaded with dark activity. It was about 15 minutes outside of town in a very rural, overgrown Mississippi. I decided to go check it out. Driving up there was odd in itself. Beat-up roads and rough-looking woods on either side. I eventually found the turnoff onto a dirt road that ran up to the cemetery. Pulling up to it, it seemed kind of small and unremarkable, really. Extremely overgrown, and the gates had a huge mess of chains with padlocks. If I really wanted to, I could have gotten over that short fence, but I really didn't want to be picking ticks off me or wind up with a snake bite. So instead I just stood at the gate and observed the groupings of tombstones. It was a very bright morning, but underneath all those trees, the entire place was quite dark. I stayed there, taking all of the place in and enjoying the shaded breeze for a little while. Then I decided to head back to town. I can't say I was disappointed with my little excursion, maybe just a tad underwhelmed. Now, at no point did I feel any different while I was there. It was one of those, oh, that's pretty cool moments. Then my mind went right back to getting into town as I got into my car and headed back that way. But about a mile down the road, the most awful feeling came over me. Just a wave of dread and intense pressure that came out of nowhere. I glanced down at my arm and all of the hair was standing straight up at the ends. I was sweating like crazy. It felt like 1,000 sets of eyes were on me, and I was constantly checking my rearview mirror because it felt like somebody was literally right there breathing down my neck. Now, I was on the verge of freaking out. It's very hard to explain the pressure and heaviness I felt in the car. Maybe like being in the box at the bottom of the ocean. Blood rushing and throbbing in my ears. I continued towards town, starting to think that something was seriously wrong with me. And as it kept escalating, I actually did begin to freak out. The next few minutes were a blur, just pure anxiety, and trying to combat it all. Checking the back seat and wondering if I should just go to the hospital or something, but at a certain point, once I got back into town, the weight was just lifted, just like that, like a fever breaking. No more pressure or dread. I was shaken the hell up, but I could breathe again. Now, I can't say I've ever had anything like this happen to me before. Not anything so immediate to start and just a sudden end. And now later today, everything is back to normal, and here I sit with no explanation for it all. Maybe someone just needed a ride back to town. Thank you all for stopping by to listen. I hope you enjoyed listening to these paranormal stories as much as I enjoyed recording them. And until next time, everyone have a great night.